Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. For those of you who were here earlier today, you, of course, know our next speaker, but I will introduce him nonetheless. And so our next speaker will be Dr. Zach Rosenthal. He's the director of the Center of Misophonia and Emotion Regulation at Duke University. Dr. Rosenthal's topic will be stress, trauma, and misophonia. And so with that, I will let Dr. Rosenthal take it away.
Thank you very much. Give me just a moment here to get this slide up and remove your infinity view. Okay. All right. So I am delighted here to spend the next 28 minutes with you all. I'm going to share some work that our team recently published in February. And I first want to just say that this is work done by our team. I'm presenting here, but this really is a team effort.
I apologize, Dr. Rosenthal. There is a comment that in the chat that cannot see the slides. Are others having that problem as well? I can see them.
I can see them okay. Okay, Paris says.
Okay, sounds like others can.
Okay. Keep going, Dr. Rosenthal. We'll see if we can figure it out.
Okay, sounds good. So this is going to be a presentation about stress, traumatic stress, and misophonia. And the first thing to do is to acknowledge my team here at Duke. We have a lot of smiling faces here on the screen. It's a bit overwhelming, I suppose, but just to sort of briefly share that this is our group right now. And if you look to the far left middle row, you'll see Rachel Guetta. And Rachel is the first author of the research that I'm presenting today. So really just want to acknowledge her and her leadership on this work. And thank you to everybody who is a part of our team. We do research, we are clinicians and treat patients. We do advocacy work, as we are today. We do education and help raise awareness about misophonia. And really just kind of are a resource for people around the world who want to learn a bit about misophonia. If you have not yet come across our Duke Center, you can access it here with these channels online here. If you're an Instagram person, you can go to @Duke Center for Misophonia. If you're interested in looking at some of our YouTube videos, we've just begun to put additional videos out, and they're @Duke CMER. And then our basic website is misophonia.duke.edu. So please do contact us. We really are honored to be here and to have the privilege to be a resource for so many people. One of the things that we collectively do across our team is we listen. We ask questions and we listen. And we hear stories about people's lived experiences pretty much every day of the week, whether that's in a research study or whether that's in a clinical evaluation, whether that's in a webinar, whether that's in a one-on-one Zoom session with family members or with clinicians or with sufferers. We are talking with people about misophonia and listening carefully very regularly. And one of the things that we ask about and we really like to listen to is about people's early childhood memories about when misophonia began. And I say early childhood because that is really what we hear most often, our childhood ages of onset. That said, we do also hear people's stories about age of onset in later adolescence or in adulthood. It's just less common. It's less commonly what we hear. So when people share their stories about what they remember, we listen and we hear a lot of different things. And one of the things that we observed that we were hearing a lot is people will tell us about all sorts of different kinds of unpleasant life events. And some people would tell us they had certain kinds of life events that were unpleasant when they were a child or a teenager, and others wouldn't. It really did vary quite a bit, and it does vary quite a bit. And that variability in what we hear from people led us to ask the question, are traumatic life events associated with misophonia? In other words, are there particular types of events that we can scientifically define as traumatic? Are those traumatic life events associated with misophonia? And maybe they are, and maybe they're not, or maybe they are for some people, but not for others. So we really just wanted to kind of understand that. And so we went to the scientific literature, of course, as good scientists do, and we looked to see what had already been done. And it's really quite interesting. When you look in the scientific literature, there are just different ways in which people have begun scientifically to address this question. So for example, in some studies where they use questionnaires or surveys, they do find that post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a psychiatric diagnosis, that post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD is correlated positively with misophonia. And what that means is that in those studies, if you have PTSD, you're more likely to have higher misophonia symptoms, not lower. So that's interesting. So that suggests, gosh, maybe there is a relationship, a correlational relationship. Those kinds of studies don't tell us about cause or effect, but they do tell us that, certain things are kind of maybe related to each other. The interesting thing, though, is if you look a little deeper into the scientific literature, what you see is that there are a few studies that have used diagnostic interviews to assess PTSD. And when you look at those studies, they pretty consistently tell a different story than the studies that use surveys. So in the PTSD diagnostic studies, PTSD is not really a common diagnosis in misophonia. So that's interesting. So why? Why might we get these discrepant findings? And one of the answers might be because asking people if they have a diagnosis or not in a survey is really not the way that we diagnose people. So we started thinking, well, let's do it a little bit more rigorous of a way, and let's take as long as it takes to do this. We used a gold standard interview to diagnose PTSD. This interview is called the SCID, S-C-I-D. You can see a picture of it on the right. And this is a very, very lengthy psychiatric diagnostic interview. It really takes hours and hours to do because it's very systematic and goes through question by question symptoms across almost all adult psychiatric disorders. So we did this interview to really kind of get clarity about not only PTSD, but other diagnoses. And then we used validated and common questionnaires to assess misophonia severity, the number and types of different kinds of lifetime traumatic events that people report having experienced, the severity and types of different PTSD symptoms. So even if you don't have a diagnosis of PTSD, you may have some symptoms. Symptoms, by the way, are people's self-report of a condition. So, you can have something you report as being consistent with a PTSD symptom without having met kind of the threshold for a full diagnosis of PTSD. So we wanted to know, even if they don't have a diagnosis per se, maybe there are sub-diagnostic symptoms that might be related to misophonia. The other thing is that we were doing this study during the kind of peak of the COVID pandemic. And of course, if you think about it, any research study on stress or probably anything mental health related or physical health related that was done during the pandemic probably needs to account for the role of the pandemic on their data. And so we used a validated measure of acute stress specifically related to COVID. So these are questions in a questionnaire that are about acute stress specifically tied to that person's experience around having COVID or knowing people who had COVID or having loss related to COVID and things of that nature. And then finally, we used a very common standard questionnaire that assesses people's lived experience of day-to-day daily stress. And what we did was we kind of did a fairly simple statistical approach to see what was most related to misophonia. And as you can see, here's just a snippet of some of what we found. These are types of lifetime traumatic experiences reported, and you can see kind of percentage here from 0 to 100. I won't go through all of them. You can take a look, and this is in our paper as well if you're curious, but you can see the most common lifetime traumatic experience among people with misophonia, these are adults, is a transportation accident. Unwanted sexual experiences and natural disasters and other very stressful or sudden unexpected experiences that were unpleasant were listed as well. Physical assault and sexual assault and so on. And if you're curious, this percentage of lifetime traumatic experiences, the ones towards the left side of the screen, they are a bit higher than what you would expect in a kind of large population of people in general. So it's a little bit more, but it's not necessarily more than what you might expect with a sample of people with various kinds of mental health related concerns. So what we really wanted to look at, though, was what percentage of people with misophonia had a diagnosis of PTSD when you, again, diagnose very carefully. And the answer was 3.5% of adults had a current diagnosis. 21.7% had a lifetime history, which also is just a bit higher than what we might expect in a general population sample, but also not much more or much different than what we might expect with other kinds of mental health related problems. And in our kind of statistics that we ran, the main takeaway simplistically here is that the experience of high daily stress was more directly related to misophonia severity than was age, sex, number of stressful lifetime experiences, PTSD symptoms, or acute stress related to COVID. So high daily stress was really kind of the most predictive or most associated of the measures. So that's kind of one main takeaway. Another thing we looked at using a type of approach called a network analysis, the same analysis that Dr. Ward presented earlier today. We used this network analysis to try to unpack what were the various relationships among the different parts of PTSD symptoms to misophonia, to stress, and then also to the COVID-related stress. And so the blue circles here are PTSD symptom clusters. So the arousal cluster, the mood and cognition cluster, the re-experiencing cluster, and the avoidance cluster. The green are the non-traumatic stress, but other kinds of acute stress symptoms. Here you have, again, COVID-related in green, and then regular kind of more generalized perceived stress. And then this orangish color here is the Duke Misophonia Questionnaire, and it's the combination of symptom severity and impairment related to misophonia combined together. So when you look at these circles and lines, it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but the easiest way to understand them is that these colors here should be related to each other because they're the same thing, right? They're PTSD. So you see a lot of relationships here with these blue lines where they're saying, yeah, these things are connected to each other. The blue lines mean that the higher the one, the higher the other. So they're related the way they should. And you can see that green is connected, so COVID-related stress connected to perceived stress. But we're all here today to understand misophonia. And so what's really maybe most important is to look at, in this misophonia circle, which of the other circles connect. And the short story here is that among the PTSD symptoms, among them, the only of the PTSD symptoms related to misophonia was the hyperarousal symptoms. And that's what you can see here with this blue line. This is really the only one that's positively associated with it. In fact, we see a negative association here in orange between avoidance and misophonia. So that's somewhat odd. The other thing to note here is that, again, this perceived stress scale is the lived experience of heightened stress. And that you can see directly related to misophonia and also directly related to COVID stress, arousal, and other PTSD symptoms. So kind of suggests that, again, misophonia, among these variables at least, it looks to be most related to stress. And if anything at all, sub-threshold of PTSD, probably to the arousal symptoms. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that if we take it all together, the number of lifetime traumatic events or PTSD as a diagnosis may not really be directly related to misophonia in most people. We need more studies, but that's certainly what this study might mean. Misophonia might be more related to the experience, the lived experience of chronic stress on a daily basis, than it may be to how old you are, your biological sex, your number of traumas experienced, or PTSD symptoms. So the takeaway is there is that accumulated stress over time may be one of the causes of misophonia. It might also be an effect of misophonia, or it might be both. It might be both. We don't know what to conclude yet from this study on that point. We try to think about how do we make sense of this in the broader landscape of the science of trauma. One of the things to understand is that almost everyone, almost every single one of you has experienced a lifetime trauma as defined by DSM-5. So traumatic stress is very, very common. Most everybody experiences a PTSD, what we call a criterion A trauma. I've had them. I've had multiple of them. Almost everyone I know has them or will have them. But only about 4% of adults have current PTSD, and about 8% ever have it, despite almost everyone having these unpleasant traumatic events happen. So how do we make sense of this? Well, traumatic stress defined by the DSM, which is the questionnaire we used, define traumatic stress the way the DSM does. So that's important because traumatic stress defined by the DSM may not include, in fact, it doesn't include every possible lifetime event that could be experienced as really upsetting or traumatic. So our hypothesis coming out of this study is that even if PTSD may not be directly related in this study, we think there might be certain kinds of highly aversive experiences that are not defined by the DSM-5 as traumatic, but are experienced subjectively as traumatic and can contribute for some people to the onset of misophonia. And another way of saying this is we don't think, based on what we know today, from everything we hear and everything we know is available scientifically, we don't think misophonia is singularly caused just by trauma or traumatic stress. We think it's much more complicated than that. We think there's biological and environmental factors, and we think the causes might be different across people, and that there might be different biological, psychological, or social processes that are maintaining misophonia and might be different across people. And with that in mind, it may be that for some people, traumatic stress is indeed a causal factor. I have patients where I can tell you their trauma history related to PTSD very much does overlap with their experience of misophonia in ways that are very clearly intuitive. But I have other patients for which that is entirely the opposite case. Real quick, our study has limitations. This is a preliminary study, and it's really important to me to be scientifically responsible and humble with the work that we do. This is just one study. There are many studies needed before we can make really clear final conclusions about all of this, but it is a first puzzle piece to really look at this in the way we did. What we need are larger samples. We need better samples that are more diverse, that represent all people and not just disproportionately some people. We need samples that look over time, the way that Dr. Simner's studies that she described earlier look over time at people. And we need to look critically at other kinds of unpleasant life experiences that may not traditionally be labeled as traumatic by the DSM-5. So last slide here is just to think about what kinds of aversive life events might be causal in misophonia, at least for some people. And here's just an example of some of the things we're starting to think about at the Duke Center. That repeated exposure to some certain highly unpleasant sounds, this is the common narrative, the common experience, where those sounds can't be avoided easily, they can't be escaped, they can't be controlled very easily. And there's an unpleasant context surrounding these sounds where there's all sorts of things happening that vary quite a bit across and within people. The environment can unintentionally be very invalidating. And I say this unintentionally because I haven't met a parent yet who has deliberately tried to have their child have misophonia, but I have met many parents and many loved ones who unintentionally have oversimplified or not understood or perhaps blamed or just made attributions that were not helpful to their loved one. And I've met many people who describe being deliberately antagonized by family members. We know this is a thing that can happen. This is usually, in my experience, reported as by siblings, not by parents. But the point is the same, that invalidation can be unintentional or intentional. And that nervous system dysregulation, emotions, thoughts, actions related to how one tries to cope and essentially adapt to this really difficult environment, those kinds of adaptations may not be understood well, and they might be unintentionally or intentionally invalidated. And now over time, hypervigilance towards triggers, efforts to avoid, to control, to cope, to regulate expressions of lack of self-efficacy, they just might not be understood well or validated well by the environment around the person. And this is not just parents or families. This is at school, this is at work, this is among friends, this is in public. And we know this can also include unpleasant, aversive, or we could call them traumatic life events like bullying, antagonism, blaming, oversimplification by others, and so on. And last but not least, and I'll stop, we on the helping side of the world, so we clinicians, we sometimes, despite our best intentions, do things that are not helpful. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to acknowledge that poor treatment, mislabeling, misdiagnosing, using strategies for therapy that are forced or suggested strongly on a person that are highly aversive and unwanted, that these things can be experienced as potentially traumatic by our patients. So this is the study itself. I'll just end on this note. It's in PLOS ONE as a journal. You can go onto Google, type in the term scholar. Now you're inside of Google Scholar, and you can look up this article and you can access it for free. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. All right, several questions already coming through. First question is regarding trends in parenting in schools. Do you think that those scenarios that may be leading to misophonia are increasing or decreasing? And what kinds of changes can we make in terms of culture and policies, presumably to decrease occurrence of misophonia?
That is an amazing question. I don't pretend to have the scientific answer to that. I wish I did. That's a really, really good question. I don't know. I would say I am not the expert on schools and school policies and policy level data, but it's a terrific question and one we should look into.
If someone, came to you that had, a significant amount of stress in their life and thought that that was related to their misophonia, would you have any suggestions to counsel them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you think about what is stress can be a lot of different things. One of the things that it is probably for most people is the experience of uncontrollable and perhaps unpredictable life experiences where they can feel overwhelmed emotionally, overwhelmed cognitively, overwhelmed with kind of making decisions, can feel constricted in the environments that they're in, may have environments where they are literally invalidated in ways that are very difficult. Or it might be that more physiologically, the experience of stress is one where the body shuts down. Now, stress is experienced and expressed very differently by people. And even within the same person, there might be different ways that it's experienced or expressed. So the kind of like short version to the answer is you'd figure out for that person what is stress, in which context, and does it look like particular biological, psychological, or social kinds of processes or interpersonal processes or whatever they might be. And then those processes probably have evidence-based interventions that a good clinician, at least a mental health provider, I can only speak for mental health providers, as I am one, a mental health provider should be able to apply those evidence-based interventions.
All right, let's see. Another question that came in is, how is an event defined as traumatic or not?
Yeah, so again, the traumatic event definition that is used by scientists when they're when they're trying to understand PTSD, it by definition is tied to the DSM-5 definition of what trauma is. So the DSM-5 defines traumatic stress in a very long-winded way, which you can look up online. And then the measures, the questionnaires, are used to define very common particular types of traumatic life events. So there's something called the stressful life events checklist. And the stressful life events checklist is the measure we use. And it's really arguably the most, or certainly among the most commonly used measures of traumatic life events. And so that questionnaire was used by us. It's used by a lot of people. And it ends up giving you kind of a percentage of people in your sample that have experienced all of the events that I listed in that graph earlier on today. The real trick for me is, how do we define trauma and traumatic stress? So researchers and healthcare providers define it in a particular way. But if you go onto social media and you just look at the word trauma, you'll see that lay people use the word trauma in a much more, I think, just a much more open, flexible, inclusive way. And I think it might mean different things to different people. When we're studying it scientifically and we're doing it the way we did, we're using a measure that's validated with a particular set of questions. So it's a long-winded way of saying that's a really, really good question. We decided to study it first this way, but as I explained in my presentation, what we think we need to do next is study it in a more inclusive way.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, just a couple of comments first before the next question. Someone commented that their misophonia started after a fatal accident where someone that they loved very deeply passed away. Another person commented that this is very fascinating. They have videos of their child with misophonia who's trying to silence or control a younger sibling's sound as an infant, and triggers and symptoms significantly increased with COVID and quarantine. So, actually following up on that point, do you think that, that major worldwide stressor could have had some impact on rates of misophonia?
Yeah, we've been asked that question many times since the pandemic started, and I think it could. We don't know, right? We don't know specifically, but it could, and certainly we know clinically that among certain people, it very much was associated with increased. You're around your family more, you're around your triggers more. You can't control, can't escape, you can't avoid. It's really just a setup for a lot of people to have increase in symptoms. I also have had many conversations with many other people who've said the exact opposite. Literally the exact opposite. So, yeah, I think it might be different for different people.
Yeah.
We're at about 2 minutes. I wanted to jump in and let you know.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's see, we may have time for one, maybe two more questions. So let's see. Personal correlations with misophonia and trauma are a common subject. What might be the next study that you would be likely to do based on this prevalence of personal narratives and also based on the lessons of this study?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We are interested in doing studies that are more inclusive. Again, we started with a very narrow definition of traumatic stress as it is typically defined by scientists in the scientific literature, just a bit more broadly. What we think is really an important next step is to look more inclusively and broadly at all sorts of different unpleasant life events that might have happened during childhood or adolescence or adulthood, to see if there are particular kinds of events. They may not be technically labeled as traumatic by the DSM, okay, but they might be really critical and really important to understand. They may not have the same label as traumatic in the scientific community. It might be called adverse childhood events or adverse events or unpleasant events. There might be different words that are used, but that's what we want to do next. That's one of the things that we're interested in.
Well, I think we may be out of time. Let's see, there is a question maybe just about your Instagram address for your Duke page. And I know that people can find a lot of information there to follow up on. And so, perhaps you want to just give it really quickly.
Sure. It's at Duke Center for Misophonia. One word, at Duke Center for Misophonia.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rosenthal. I apologize. There were so many great questions that came in. We were unable to get to all of them. But, please do go and follow the Duke Center and, reach out to Dr. Rosenthal. Is always open, I know, to answering questions. And thank you very much for your talk today.
Thank you, everyone. My pleasure.